Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that because yeah, that was a question of mine. That is the possibility for diplomacy now, as well, from what I understand, in Iran, well, let's call them the hawks, made the warnings that, well, hawks, it seems predictable that, as you said, the US wouldn't implement the MOU, but this was essentially the argument for continuing the fighting. It appears that, well, their argument won through. That is, that they were correct. The US would not live up to this. So you would assume that the more hardline views within Tehran would now gain some momentum. So what is the possibility now of diplomacy? Because, well, again, if you want to put in the wider context, that is the JCPOA, which was never implemented by the US, and then they withdrew. Then there was two attacks on Iran while there were claims they were close to a deal. One just gets the impression that diplomacy is a mere instrument to yeah, regroup, and yeah, well, shape the battlefield more favorably. So, given that diplomacy now has been well, destroyed or diminished to such an extent, what is Iran's approach now to further talks with the US? Because on one hand, yes, I wouldn't trust the US either if I was sitting in Tehran. On the other hand, at some point, one needs to talk to come to put an end to this whole thing.
It's interesting, and you're absolutely correct. There have been divisions, and we've discussed this together before in Iran about the way forward. And after the MOU, there was a divide about how to deal with the United States. Uh, some were saying that the MOU is decent enough. We have to export our oil and import critical goods, and if the Americans don't abide by the MOU, we'll just refrain from easing up on the Strait of Hormuz. Others were saying that we should have just continued with the war and we shouldn't have signed the MOU. Now, who was right and who was wrong? I think all of them, there was a consensus that the MOU wouldn't last. So, but there were differences in the fact that the MOU was signed in any way, that the Iranians came to this agreement. Though that gap has lessened because now we're back at war. So Iranian politics is more divided. It's more united. Now, Vance said something on last night on Rogan's show, the Joe Rogan show. That was nonsense. He was saying that in Iran there are these two factions. Some are reasonable, some are crazy, and the reasonable one says we shouldn't have hit the ships. That's all nonsense. I mean, nothing in Iran happens without a mandate from the Supreme National Security Council. The guards, the army, no one has the ability to just go fire missiles or fire drones or anything like that. That's simply not going to happen. And in Iran, as I said, the only reason why Iran struck those ships was because the Americans were violating the MOU, and those ships, the governments that controlled those ships, were assisting the Americans in the violation. And the Iranians were not going to accept that, because if you allow the Americans to undermine the deal, then they will undermine you. So Iranian politics is united today, more united than it was a week ago. On the other hand, and I'm sure you have, if you've listened to what J.D. Vance was saying on the show, it's clear that politics in the White House are not all that united. J.D. Vance seems to be speaking a very different language than Trump and others around Trump. But also, in addition to that, you see the attempt by the Trump to get to have an additional budget for the war, for the Pentagon, for the Secretary of War. Attempts to increase the budget have been met with strong resistance from the Democrats because they see that the American population is opposed to the war, and Democrats disproportionately, almost universally opposed to the war. So you see resistance to that. If that resistance continues, that's going to make it difficult for Trump to continue waging the war because he needs the extra money. So Vance is not doesn't seem to be in full coordination with Trump. The Senate and the House may create problems for Trump in continuing the war. So while the political scene in Tehran is more united today with the start of the war, in the United States, it seems to be much more divided. And this, I think, means that there may be opportunity in the future to force the United States to change its policy, but the Iranians are not interested for the time. So I don't think that we're going to have a ceasefire anytime soon. I think that this is going to continue for a while. And then what the Iranians will want is the United States to actually implement the deal or implement certain demands. The Iranians are not going to accept any new piece of paper. They're going to say, you carry these out, and then this trade can be normalized. Now, Trump may be able to say that he spoke to some of his imaginary Iranian friends and imaginary Iranian leaders, and that they gave him everything he wanted, and they gave him bigly gifts, and that sort of thing, and then justify another retreat. And that may be the case, but I don't see the Iranians going back to the negotiating table at all until action is taken. So it doesn't matter to the Iranians what the Americans say. The Iranians, as I said, didn't trust them back then. The Iranians thought this was the MOU provided an opportunity for swiftly bringing in supplies and exporting oil. So I think that the next few days, I'd be very surprised if the United States halts operations in the next few days. But even if the United States does, I think that Iran will continue to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed until the United States implements what it promised to do. Whether you call it the MOU or anything else, the Iranians want those demands to be met. Otherwise, there won't be the free flow of oil or anything else through the strait.
Well, I just want to circle back to something you said earlier on. That is that the situation in Iraq has also shifted to a great extent as a result of this war. And indeed, I've seen some reports that there's been some fighting close to the Iraqi border with Kuwait. And I was just wondering, what is the overall relevance here of Iraq? Because again, if I think for the United States, ideally, and I'm not saying that's not a possibility anymore, but ideally they would want to use ground troops. So, usually they fight through proxies. You use other people, so you use Ukrainians against Russia. You use Filipinos, for example, against the Chinese. But Iraqis would ideally have been an instrument for the United States to be used again against Iran. You, as a veteran of the Iraq-Iran war, I don't have to tell you, of course, but what is the relevance now of Iraq? I mean, can they play a significant role in this war on the side of Iran?
Yes, no doubt. I mean, the Americans do use proxies against Iran. The Kurdish terrorists in northern Iraq and other terror groups, they exist there. They train there, and they're funded. And the Iraqi local government, the Kurdish government, tolerates them. So they have bases, and the Iranians are bombing them literally every day. Also, you have the Wahhabi, Salafi, Takfiri elements in Pakistan's Baluchistan, where Pakistan doesn't have much control. They are trained, they carry out operations in Iran, and we've seen more activity in these two areas than before. But these groups won't be able to do anything important. They don't have that capability. their numbers are small. So if the Americans want to carry out a land operation, they'll have to do it themselves. And the places where the Americans are being prepared or have been trying to prepare themselves for potential land operation is one is Kuwait and the other is Bahrain. That's why they're being attacked disproportionately. Anything that could be linked to a land operation against Iran is being bombed in these two countries. Now, this Glenn, is important. From what I'm hearing from Iranian people who know a thing or two about the military, the U.S. bombing of Iran is being carried out in a way which would be appropriate for ground invasion. The targeting, the places that are being bombed are more appropriate for a land offensive. Now, the problem, the reason why this surprises me a bit, and it surprises the Iranian military, is that now is not the time for land operation because the heat and the humidity in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Persian Gulf is very high. It's in the high 40s and the 50 degrees, over 50 degrees, and the humidity is like 100%, especially on the other side and around the Strait of Hormuz. Around the Persian Gulf, the immediate surrounding of the Persian Gulf. So if the Americans want to take islands, it will be hell on earth. Just when they'll be in their uniforms and they'll be carrying and they'll be running, and during the day that would be very dangerous to do. Troops could die as a result of the heat very easily. So now is not the best time to carry out a land invasion. The Iranians were, as I said, the Iranians did not believe the Americans would carry out the MOU. The Iranians believed that the Americans would, if they carry out a land invasion, they would do it in late September or after late September, when the temperatures begin to cool. They would still be hot, but they would not be as horrible and difficult as now, which would be terrible for morale. And I'm sure the U.S. Soldiers in the region, their morale is very low because Iranian soldiers, they go home, even in the more difficult areas near the Persian Gulf region, with difficult meaning the heat and all that. But for the Americans, they're just based in a terrible and under terrible circumstances, and their equipment is not well protected. The dust storms, the humidity, the heat. It's definitely not good for any of the equipment. The hundreds of billions of dollars of worth of equipment that has been brought to the region. So, but the pattern is that of an armed forces that wants to carry out a land operation. So whether they do it or not, I don't know. The Iranians are hitting very hard, and they are prepared for a land war. They've been preparing for decades. The Iranians, we discussed this during the 40-day war before on your show when I said that the Iranians actually want the Americans to carry out a land invasion, and the same is true now because they felt that if there was a land invasion, they would win. The Iranians would win. The Iranians would let them take some islands. They'd let them take parts of the mainland, wherever they want to go. And then they would start hitting them. And American soldiers would be very vulnerable. And supporting those soldiers would be very difficult because the other side of the Kuwait is far away. Bahrain is far away. The logistics of an operation would be very difficult and very difficult to sustain. So the Iranians believe that if the Americans carry out a land operation, that would actually end the war sooner because this would be the final defeat. But that didn't happen back then, and the Iranians are planning for it now. But they're just surprised that the Americans are conducting themselves in a way at the moment that would be appropriate for a somewhat imminent land invasion, or a land invasion that would be carried out before late September.
Well, if the U.S. Would do a land invasion, and again, I've seen the same. Well, the reports that obviously every day I see Kuwait and Bahrain especially being hit very hard. But what my last question is just about Saudi Arabia, though. To what extent do you think they might involve themselves in such an operation? Because if you want to seize any Iranian islands, for example, or even try to invade the Iranian mainland, you would think they would need the Saudis.
Glenn, the real issue, I think, it was just announced a few hours ago again by the military, that if Iran's critical infrastructure is targeted, they will destroy everything. And they said that during the 40-day war as well. But a land invasion would mean destroying critical infrastructure by nature. You'll be taking territory. You'll be destroying it. So I think that all of these countries are at risk, and Saudi Arabia in particular is at risk from the Red Sea and from Yemen too. It, I don't see. I mean, the problem is, Glenn, that these countries recognize that their interests are not in fighting against Iran. But in the case of Kuwait and the regime in Bahrain, they are. I mean, maybe the regime in Bahrain is. I mean, it is very dependent on American support to exist. But Kuwait and Bahrain have shown a particular hostility towards Iran during the last few weeks. But if there is a land war, the Iranians will not continue just focusing on these two countries. If Iran's critical infrastructure is taken out on these islands or the United States occupies them, then I don't think Iran will retaliate. And the armed forces have said that all critical infrastructure in the region will be destroyed. If that happens, that brings an end to these countries. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman too, now that they've been helping the Americans. They can't survive if Iran strikes their critical infrastructure, because these countries are they're desert countries. They don't. I mean, Iran is a country you've visited. Iran has forests. Iran has rivers. Iran has mountains. Iran it has deserts, but it has everything else too. Iran is almost self-sufficient in agriculture, despite the sanctions. If it wasn't for the sanctions, Iran would be would be more than just self-sufficient. And this year we've had a pretty good rain, better than average, slightly, whereas we had a drought for the last 3-4 years. So if there is all-out war, and if they try to take Iranian territory, if they start striking Iranian critical infrastructure, as Trump has threatened to do, Iran doesn't want to go there. But that would mean all-out war. And we've seen, I'm sure you've seen the footage of Iranian missile strikes and drone strikes during the last few days. Very precise, better than before. It's clear that the missile capabilities of Iran are being enhanced, both in quality and quantity. And Iran can easily take out the key oil-producing assets, the key gas-producing assets, the key electrical power plants, and they're not that many in these countries. They're big and big and close to Iranian borders. Iran doesn't even have to use its long-range missiles. In fact, during the last few days, Iran has not been using more than a handful of its long-range missiles. It's been using short-range and medium-range missiles and drones to strike. And only on a few occasions, probably just for, I don't know, practice, did they use long-range missiles. So this is, I think, is the biggest danger. So Saudi Arabia is in a very particularly dangerous situation. because it is the only country that continues to export oil through the Red Sea, through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not possible anymore. But it's antagonized Yemen, and the Yemenis are not going to back down. On the other hand, if the United States carries out a land invasion, that means by nature targeting Iranian critical infrastructure, because you'd be taking that territory. And if Trump carries out the threat to strike Iranian bridges and electrical power plants, then I would say that these countries would probably cease to exist. And remember, in these temperatures, people would have to leave immediately. They would have to go to Iraq or Yemen or Syria, but they most certainly won't be able to stay anywhere near the Persian Gulf region.
Yeah, this is incredible. I think one of the key lessons from the war against Iran has, in my opinion, been that the illusion of escalation control is quite dangerous, and I think the U.S. still hasn't really embraced that lesson. As we now see, I think this war can, deepen and widen very, very quickly, and it's an interesting situation. I just don't see a military option for the United States. Obviously, they didn't see one either before. That's why they signed the MOU, and also now the diplomatic window is shutting down. So, no, it's yeah, incredible situation. Anyways, I would have
I
taken
think
an
just
hour of your
one
day.
final
Do you have any?
point. Yeah, just one final point.
Yeah,
I think that the Americans know that this was foolish, and the geography of the region doesn't benefit the United States. And again, if these countries do collapse, that means we go into a global economic depression far worse than the 1930s. Uh, Iraq would be much more safe. Yemen would be much more safe, and of course, Iran would be much more safe than staying in the Arabian Peninsula under these circumstances. So that collapse would be irreversible. But the point is that, well, why is this happening? Why is the United States doing this? And I think it goes back to what Joe Kent said at the very beginning when he handed in his resignation letter at the beginning of the war. He was a Trump appointee. He was as high up in the intelligence ladder as you can possibly get. He said that it's the Zionist lobby and the Israeli machine. They want this war. That added, if you add that to hubris and Trump's arrogance and American exceptionalism, that is the only reason why this is happening. Otherwise, anyone, basically what Trump seems to be doing is he's gambling the House. And in the hope that somehow, that miraculously he will come out on top. But that's not what's going to happen. So and that's why I think what Vance said in the interview, despite the nonsense that he said about Iran being fanatic, there are one group of fanatics and one group of crazy people, and the other group sensible people. He needs to say that in order to not be seen as turning against Trump. He's repeating that narrative. But what I think Vance recognizes that this ship is going to sink, and that he has to get off the ship. And maybe he sees himself as the person who can save the ship. But this doesn't make sense. And I think Vance's statements sort of indicate that the Democrats in the House and the Senate, their resistance to the money that wants to be provided to the Department of War, I think are indicative of that too.